Okay, what I want to look at in this video is actually sort of, or in this presentation, is sort of an offshoot of what you guys have as that little sort of weird quiz. I couldn't resist. I just found that Mongol TV about a week ago, and I find it absolutely fascinating. So what we're going to do is a little example of how anthropologists start doing field work. Now, this is not an area of research that I'm involved in formally, but it is something I've become fascinated with in the last couple of years, specifically actually this last year. And this is sort of an outshoot of oftentimes what gets anthropologists interested. And I suspect if you talk to Miller or guys like that, you'd find it's the same thing. They become interested in Facebook or YouTube simply because they see people using it and they wonder what's going on, you know, because you have to remember, anthropologists are always looking at the relationship of individuals in the group, how groups identify and how groups sort of, you know, present themselves. And I think that's where the Mongol TV is fascinating, because that just, I don't know why, but you know, just as a warning, those who are way too familiar with YouTube, that up next column on the right-hand side can oftentimes have some really sophisticated search, Google-based search tracking in terms of your interest, which oftentimes can lead you off down the rabbit hole, as it were. So this is sort of an example of that. So what I want to look at really quickly, and it's going to be fairly short, is looking at culture and ethnicity and ethnic identity as it's both used in YouTube, and how YouTube, I think, in a very impressive way, or a very interesting way, is being used to present culture and or ethnicity, in most cases probably ethnicity, in ways to either reinforce group identity, or I think in a lot of cases in YouTube, what you actually see is groups. In this case, we're going to look at groups that are trying to bring people back in or bring people into the ethnic group. One of the interesting thing about, I think, all three of these, or well, given the Mongol one you've already got, especially that group who, I think that's how they pronounce it, operates, is that on one hand, they are performance, so they can be consumed by everyone. On the other hand, one thing you'll see that's in common with all three of the, well, actually not this first group, is that they're using the language that they're presenting in. I think the second group we'll see is in German. That's what it sounds like. I haven't investigated where Fallen comes from, or whatever that Skald comes from. But feel free to Google that and find out what they're about. But there's the thing about all three of these presentations, one you've already got, and the other two I'm going to show you, is that they're in YouTube, and that they are obviously presenting themselves as an alternative to not so much, I would say, globalized culture, but what you might call sort of regional megacultures. In the case of the Mongols / Hu, that megaculture would be China. China very aggressively is trying to erase, if you would, ethnic identity both in its borders and I think also sort of marginally around it. Which is really sort of the oddest of the bunch. That's actually where I first noticed it, because Chinese society traditionally has been very disinterested in other groups, even within China. If you're a minority group in China till 10 years ago, no one gave a squat what you did. As long as if you wanted to be part of government or part of the system, you learned Mandarin, spoke, did the Chinese way of stuff. But what you did at home or in your own enclave was your business. So Chinese society traditionally, it's not so much that they're inclusive, but they're just disinterested in anyone that wants to do their own thing. Now that's changed radically under the current administration under Hu Jintao, which all of a sudden they decided everyone in China has to be Han Chinese, which is the majority ethnic group. The first of these we're going to look at is where I first saw this. About 10 years ago, I guess, we were in Scotland, in Edinburgh. And one of the things I noticed when we were in a pub talking to some guys is that the pub we went to, by virtue of asking a guy in a museum, was a very explicitly Gaelic Scottish pub. So the folks in there were very big on not speaking English. They would speak to it because they saw us as coming from Hawaii, so therefore we were interesting outsiders. But they discouraged folks that they saw as being British, i.e. coming up from England, into going into the pub. And they were very adamant that what they were is Scottish. And so, wearing the kilt, wearing stuff, doing stuff that was Scottish, speaking Gaelic, was a really big deal to them. Now, this is a classic example of ethnic identity, where you're actually doing this, like we were talking about. You've got this whole enclave of people who agree on what it is. They go to a great extent to basically make that happen. And that was starting to show up in the street in terms of performance. Now, this is, I didn't see these guys, but they were mentioned to me. They had just started up, the band had started up then. They've now become quite popular. So since we've now, I think this is screen share is working. You guys should be able to see this. Now, one of the things from an anthropological standpoint that's really fascinating, and again, you know, it really, to be honest, it sort of bothers me that in the social sciences, there's very little interest in the type of data you've got here. If you look at this particular, you know, summary of this one performance by this group, and it's not even by them. This is someone else who's either taken the video or is you know, bought theirs. Notice how this particular video has been watched over 13 million times. In fact, it's getting close to 14 million times. It's been up for 7 years. If you think about it, anything that's been consumed 14 million times is saying something about the population. There sure as hell aren't 14 million Scots, I don't think. So this is acquiring a viewing audience that's absolutely huge. The number of folks, 247, that like it. 247,000 people like it. So at some point or another, if you're looking at how people deal with things from an anthropological standpoint, it's really important to look at this because, you know, there's almost nothing else you see where you actually get some sort of idea of how consumed it is. If you see a newspaper article, you don't know how many people read it. If you watch a show on TV, you don't know how many people watched it. One of the huge sort of resources that's vastly underused by the social sciences, including anthropology, is just paying attention to the stats in something like YouTube. Because at some point it gives you an indication about this isn't, you know, 5,000 people watching this and sort of wondering why these guys are dressed like this and doing, like, you know, sort of weird shit. This is something that at some point people are not only watching, but it's a good bet they're forwarding and sending it on. If you're going to get 14 million, that's not 14 million people are just surfing YouTube and found this by accident. So let's watch just a second. And the interesting thing about this is you have to remember that this group is very intentionally, the way that they give themselves, the way they identify themselves. This is Edinburgh about, what, 7 years ago, or Glasgow, Glasgow. This is not normal streetwear. Glasgow people wear the same stuff, you know, that you'd wear anywhere else in Europe. So these guys are explicitly making themselves look different. In their own way, in a 2013 way, they're trying to look like what Scots would look like 400 or 500 years ago, say in the 1600s, maybe 1700s. I'm not sure exactly what these guys place themselves. To a certain extent, this guy's headdress, certainly the fact they're all wearing the same plaids, not the clan plaids that tend to be, that were popularized ironically by the Brits in the 1800s. They're modern drums, but the music and the performance they're doing is a modern reinterpretation of traditional Scottish music prior to the influence of what you might call the European classical tradition. In other words, it would be sort of a modern reinterpretation of Celtic music. Now, the interesting thing is these guys sell DVDs. They're on Amazon Prime. They're on one of the music services. So, you know, on one hand, this is modern. They've got their own YouTube channel. They do performances. They even have concerts. You know, I mean, so these guys are, on one hand, they're very much part of the 21st century. They're using the digital media of the 21st century to make a message. One is about the music that they do. But notice how their music is very explicitly sort of ethnic, but it's not ethnic in the sense of an ethnic group trying to identify itself in the 21st century. It's sort of like an ethnic group that's trying to identify themselves as being from here, but they're referencing themselves to the past. So to a certain extent, they're using an idealized version of what the Scots used to do back in the day to reinforce what being Scottish should be. In the 21st century, that people don't want to identify themselves with that particular ethnicity. Now, they would argue that this is cultural, and you know, this is where the puzzle between culture and ethnicity sort of becomes a vague thing. I would argue it's ethnic because, one, they make money out of it. Two, they're very explicitly putting themselves in opposition to the sort of English-based reality of the modern society in that period. I mean, it's not by accident they're performing with this as a backdrop. These guys, a lot of these groups, if you look at them, they're actually really sophisticated in terms of how they present themselves as a contrast to the world that they want to see themselves as different from. So what better way is to do something that's basically supposedly a 400 or 500-year-old music tradition that the British didn't like. You have to remember, for a period of time after the British controlled Scotland, they made playing the pipes illegal, and they made these type of outfits illegal. So in the same way that hula was stopped for a period in the 19th century, for a much longer period when England took over Scotland, they made the Scots basically gut anything that made Scots different than English. For example, this guy's hat, I can't remember what they call that, a tam or something like that. Those were illegal for about 300 years. Because to wear one meant that you were Scottish, you were trying hard not to be part of the British Empire, which is what you were part of. Same thing happened in Wales and Ireland. So these guys dressing this way, those rules aren't in place now. And in England, they could give a rat's ass what you dress like and how you do stuff. So these guys are referring to historical oppression or historical censorship, not 21st century censorship. But that's part of their cultural identity, is what they have gone through in the past is part of what makes them who they are now. And this should sound familiar, because there's nothing about this that's uniquely Scottish. So notice how the performance is actually part of this whole who we are, but it's in the context of other groups who are not part of what we are. So let's stop this one and segue to the other one. So it's sort of clunky, but I'm having to move around between stuff here. Okay, let's see if we can pull this up. Here's one. I was actually just looking for a group called Faun, F-A-U-N. They've got a really surreal video that's absolutely perfect for my argument, but for whatever reason, I can't find it right now. This is another group. This is out of Germany and or Scandinavia. I'm not sure. I think it's German that they're using, but it would actually make more sense if this were Danish or Swedish. So if any of you know, let me know, because I'm not, to be honest, I'm not particularly sure. So this is another part of Europe. This is another group trying to, in part, tie to a identity that's not part of the, European or even German, Swedish, or Danish, whatever it is, identity in the 21st century. But again, this is a YouTube video. This is a staged performance. But in that context, it's intentionally just as a note, the word skald is an old, I believe, Danish word for a chanter or singer. So notice how, again, what you've got is a group that very intentionally is presenting themselves. In this case, my guess would be, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, North Germany, maybe 900 AD. Well, actually, no, probably earlier than that, because this is obviously supposed to be pre-Christian. So this is dealing with basically the whole sort of presentation of especially what would be called Vikings. Your Viking runic tradition. I think that's actually, must be probably Danish or something for the word rune, which means it's a symbol, but it's also a prayer system. So you've got a group here that's basically going back, again, 21st century modern, very sophisticated videos. So there's someone doing video mixing, music mixing, the whole 9 yards. But on the other hand, the way that you're presenting yourself, the way that you're dressing, the way that you're sort of singing the music is supposed to go back to something that would be maybe 1,300 years old. Now, having done that, they're using electric instruments and all sorts of stuff. So it's this weird sort of paradox, but I don't think the group's bothered by that. And again, look at the number of views. Over 22 million views. It's only been up for 2 years. It's got 337,000 likes. So there's a number of folks that are seeing this for whatever set of reasons as being of interest. If I can actually find the really weird one, there's one that's absolutely sort of surreal and sort of nightmare provoking a little bit, which is actually much more of a very explicit reference to a pre-Christian Nordic tradition. I'll see if I can post that just as a sort of FYI for you in the Canvas site. But again, when you look at this, what you're actually seeing is a group referring to an idealized past and a set of sort of values or cultural traditions that they want to either bring back or reinforce. If you want to, the word oftentimes used is the idea of core values, which is a big thing with ethnicity. In ethnicity, the core values that make you unique are almost invariably going to be embedded in history, because it's in history that your ethnic group becomes identified. And it's in history that they invoke their values. I've never heard of an ethnic group that's going to invoke now. We are this because we thought of this last week. I mean, I can't see how that would happen. So you're always going to find something. Now, it's not by accident that the Scottish guys were going back to a period in the 1600s. In fact, my gut feeling is you're probably looking at 1700s. I think I think it was called the Jacobite Rebellion. Anyway, something in the 1700s, the Scots revolt against English rule, and they do have a little bit of success, and they get their butts absolutely kicked. If you go back further, there was the whole sort of like Braveheart movie, that whole traditional Wallace and them. But I think it's probably the 1700s that British group Clanadonia is referring to, the last time they fought against the British. And so if you would, the last time that the Scots were an independent ethnic group doing their own thing, speaking Gaelic and playing the bagpipes and allowed to be their own traditions versus being sort of a suppressed group. I'm not sure where this comes from. I'm not sure if you were going to look at these guys where in Northern Europe they would see the suppression. My suspicion in part that would be Christianity, specifically Catholicism, would be part of the suppression of culture or suppression of ethnic identity. There's a ton of different groups that do this. Like I said, there's one called Faun, F-A-U-N, which has absolutely beautiful videos. And a lot of those videos have got, I think in one case, 34 million hits. So, just stunning popularity on YouTube that again sort of reflect a group trying to identify themselves. That Mongol group called Hu is a fascinating example of a group. They've got some other of their videos in there. That one I put on there, the Genghis Khan one, is a really fascinating example of a group that in a very 21st century way is very explicitly trying to present in a modern consumable way some of the stuff that they think is important in the identity of being Mongol, which was also that sort of really cool Mongol TV, I don't know what you want to call it, dance video, for lack of a better term. So in all these, what you see, I think, is actually something very important. This is something that, again, you have to remember, anthropologists, like all other social researchers, aren't used to using media like YouTube, because YouTube's only been around for, I think, 10 years. It's only been wildly popular for about 6. So it's so new, it's very hard for academics who aren't known for jumping on new things anyways, to sort of see what this means. Now, one of the reasons I bring all this up is when you look at ethnic identity from the standpoint of also my sort of parallel background in geography, ethnic identity in the last 30 or 40 years, well, let's reverse this. Ethnic identity before the 1980s was not a big thing. For classically in the US Census, for example, there were relatively few categories you could check in the census box. One of them, for example, was Native American, which had also included Hawaiian at the time. And what you found is the vast majority of folks in the United States would identify themselves as American. They saw that as their identity. If you went to England, you'd find a large part of the population would identify themselves as being English, and that would include the people living in Scotland, who had Scottish last names. If you suddenly segue, something happens in the 1980s, and it's probably going to be maybe 50, 100 years in the future, we're going to figure this out. For some reason, in a lot of different places, and I think it's probably tied to the internet, as globalization becomes more visible, as globalization becomes more consumed, think of early versions of music streaming, for example, and video streaming. The growth of cable TV and cable networks and then broadcast networks. As all this starts to grow, what happens is as stuff that's globally consumable becomes not only more persistent, but more pervasive, what you apparently seem to see is like a counter push against that, but not at the level of the nationality. So, for example, if the census or the summary of the study they did in the early 1990s in England, found that there was a massive increase in the number of people in Scotland that were calling themselves Scottish instead of British. The folks in the West who are from Wales, there was a large increase in the number of folks who were calling themselves Welsh instead of just part of, English. So what you got was the number of people in the package of areas called the United Kingdom was the same, and in fact growing. But the number of people identified as the majority group by English was shrinking really dramatically. So it wasn't a change in population, it was a change in how people were seeing themselves and how they were identifying themselves. This hit the United States in a real dramatic way in the early 21st century, when they suddenly saw this enormous shift in American society with people's self-identity. The number of people currently, for example, the last couple of censuses identify as American has just gone, it's shrunk. What you see is a massive increase in people identifying themselves as some other group. Now, it's not necessarily, sort of long historical minority groups, African American, Native American, Hispanic, Latinos. What you find is even folks that are part of the mainstream will identify themselves, for example, being Irish American or Polish American or German American. Something that would have been unthinkable, say 30 or 40 years ago, where they would have been really hard to try to be American. Now they're trying equally hard to not be that overall category. So the number of people in the United States has increased. Now, these aren't new migrants. These are folks that in many cases have been here for generations that have decided that the label American is not the one they want to be. The label of American is not. They want to be something more specific that they see tied to a particular set of values, attitudes, whatever. And so what you find is and this is something that's growing. I don't think it really showed up in YouTube a while ago, but to be honest, I haven't gone back to look at it. I just noticed it again when I was looking at sort of this interesting pattern that I saw in Edinburgh, which is probably the most English of Scottish cities, with the number of folks there who are identifying very aggressively with being Scottish and making it very clear that Scottish is not English. Which was the first time I'd ever actually noticed that. I mean, it's an obvious thing here with the issue of, for example, being Hawaiian versus sort of the American colonial presence. But I didn't realize that was part of a larger phenomena. And then I started to realize if you go into something like YouTube, you see a ton of different groups. If you look at these guys on the side, there's a bunch of different groups doing stuff that's not part of, the classic sort of European tradition, and equally well, it's not part of what was globally consumed. The idea of sort of ethnic music that's referring to some sort of past, but it's modern music, but with connotations of some other period of place, some other set of values, is becoming a really big phenomenon. I have never seen any discussion of this yet, because anthropologists would have to do it. And be honest, I think people are just starting to think about this now. I personally have no idea how you would actually study this in any sort of coherent way. Maybe by tracking a particular group and looking, for example, say in Scandinavians, I assume these guys are Scandinavian. If you look at Scandinavian groups, what percentage of modern Scandinavian music is actually folks trying to sort of re-identify with some sort of ethnic past? And how popular is that versus, like, God, what was that group before you guys were born? I think it was called ABBA or something like that. Anyways, they're like, sort of classic modern, Euro-American pop, rap or whatever it is, the big thing in this part of Europe. In other words, this is nothing to do with the contemporary world. It's obviously and very explicitly referring to another. If you would, sort of, this is like a musical version of Game of Thrones, except rather than Game of Thrones being supposedly another place, this is obviously supposed to be in the world we're in. It's just not in the time that we're in. So when you look at this, I think the big thing about these groups, at least what it strikes me that's important to them, is they're actually trying, I think in part, it's almost a recruiting process. I think these groups on one hand are presenting something that means something to them. They go to a huge amount of time and effort to do this stuff. It's expensive to do these videos. When you do them, you have no guarantee you're going to make any money off of them. And they're obviously very good at what they do. And a lot of the stuff, someone who used to be a musician, is very difficult to do if you're using old instruments. It's hard to make old instruments work because they don't work the way modern instruments do. So it takes a lot of work to figure out how to make, for example, this guy's using antler as rhythm things. I can guarantee if you're a regular drummer, figuring out how to use those antlers is not something you just cook up in a couple of hours. All of this takes a lot of time and effort and skill on their part to do this versus just, being 2020 grunge band or something like that. So, not to mention even the costumes are obviously incredibly expensive, I suspect. So what you're looking at in this particular context is people going to a lot of effort to present their interpretation of part of their past, a very idealized past. But I think they're doing that because they want to try to get the audience, some of this 22 million people, to become interested in rediscovering who they're from. If you want to put it in another way, I think what these folks in part see their agenda as being is trying to bring back folks who could be part of this Scandinavian ethnic tradition, whichever part it is, back to the fold. The Clanadonia guys, there was an interesting interview I saw a couple of years ago where they're talking to the old guy with the hat that's sort of the lead. And he was actually saying that one of the main reasons they were motivated was to try to get folks who are Scottish to re-identify with what that means. So they were explicitly performers for the purpose of recruiting to bring people back into the ethnic fold. I'm not sure how much of that is, but I'm willing to bet. You look at the Celtic tradition, you look at these guys. There's a ton of groups in Ireland doing this type of stuff. I think this is becoming a global phenomenon. I'm not sure how much you see in the United States, because I think ethnic identity in the mainland is a really fuzzy, sort of fuzzy thing. But I think if you look at a lot of other societies, it's become a really big deal. And it's not by accident. A friend of mine pointed out, who lives in Hong Kong, as he pointed out on Chinese media, which of course is controlled by the state under Weibo, which is the big sort of Chinese version of everything, Google and the whole package, that some of the ethnic performances or ethnic groups that performed ethnic music in China that were part of minority groups have been delisted. So you can't go into Weibo and find some of the minority groups in China that were doing stuff like this because the Chinese government has decided this is counterproductive to what they want, which is a China-only or a China-centric People's Republic. Doesn't include the discussion of folks that want to go back to another set of traditions. And the fact that governments see this as being an issue, at least the Chinese government doesn't, I suspect they're not alone, is sort of interesting. But I think more importantly is what this does, it starts to show in the last 30 or 40 years that ethnicity, ethnic identity, has become, for many folks, a very important part of their world and their life. That this is them. Now you see this in some ways, and again, I haven't looked at this yet, it'd be interesting to see this. If you go to Europe and places like that, if you watch folks from Europe, you notice there's a really interesting increase in the number of folks with tatau, i.e. body art, that ties back to various traditions versus body art that used to be, I love, so-and-so's name, or I love my mom, or I'm patriotic, or something like that. What you see is, I suspect, and it'd be interesting to talk to major, tattoo companies. There's an enormous increase, for example, they call tribal art. But I think you'd also find there's a lot of increase in folks marking their bodies to identify the ethnicity they see themselves. And it's not by accident. When you watch a lot of these groups and you watch the close-ups, you realize a lot of these folks have pretty significant, oftentimes pretty spectacular body art that's tied to the way they're trying to present their identity, that I think in many ways is a very calculated attempt to say what they're not a part of. In my view, if this was, we'll just say arbitrarily, these guys are German. I think they're probably Danish, but if these guys are German, what they're saying is we're not part of Merkel's 21st century modern Germany. We think Germany should be, our idea of German ethnicity is this type of thing. Now, the fact that ethnicity has become such a compelling phenomena, I think, and again, YouTube would be a good example of that just by the numbers we're looking at, says something real important about how people identify themselves and what type of groupness becomes the motivator. Now, at some point in a rather scary way, I think you could probably tie all this in a political way to the fact that nationalism and ethnic identity has become a major force politically in most countries, and certainly it's true in the United States, but especially in Europe. If you pay any attention to European politics has almost entirely now been subsumed at the national or sort of Euro level by the idea of very localized, regionalized, very ethnic identity. And there's a bunch of complicated reasons, but I don't think it's just a European thing. I think that Mongol TV and that Mongol stuff is equally compelling. And when you think about it, that's why he's got these three things: Scottish, Nordic, and then Mongol. But if you look at them, they're all sort of, there's a similarity there. There's something going on. And to an anthropologist, this is the type of stuff we look at. Now, of course, as with most anthropologists, I get distracted really easily. So when you look at stuff like this, it's really intriguing. It's real easy to jump into it a little bit. It's a little hard to figure out what's going on, but this is what anthropologists do. We look at groups, and I think in something like YouTube, there's a tremendous resource base, because you can watch this thing 100 times if you want. And you can keep track of how many people have paid attention to them and how many people like it and don't like it. There's a huge amount of data, which we've never had in the past. If you went to the Merry Monarch and you watched a group dance at Merry Monarch, okay, fine, there's the audience there, it might be on TV. You have no idea, one, how many people consume it. And most importantly, you don't have any idea how many people really like it. You don't have any idea why they're there. One of the huge things for an anthropologist is there's actually an enormous amount of what we would call traditionally data that's held in YouTube, and it's true of all social media, that allows us a really sort of modified ways to look or measure, if you would, maybe, how people interact and how they identify. So if you want to think about this for a second, you might want to troll through and try to think, if you already have a particular pattern of ethnic music you like, what that is. And if you don't, given what you see as your sort of cultural background or whatever, is there a type of this type of music, which I would call pretty explicitly sort of historical ethnic music, which actually is supposed to try to bring you into that set of values and stuff that identify with that group. So a little bit different, but this ties in both this idea of theory. Performance is a huge part of what anthropologists look at, whether it be ritualized performance, which is the old way you used to do it. Merry Monarch at the Merry Monarch Hula Festival would be a good example of ritualized performance. This, on the other hand, is a different type of thing, not because it's not ritualized, but because it's packaged in a very tidy 3-minute episodic staged something. And it's sort of interesting when you look at this, if this is becoming increasingly popular, if Hatsune Miku is becoming increasingly popular, then what is becoming decreasingly popular? Is, traditional, whatever the current trend today is in terms of sort of pop or modern music, is that the one taking the hit? What's shrinking as this grows? Because it's definitely on the growth curve. And figuring out what it means, why there's so much range of diversity in it, is something that you're going to find anthropologists looking more and more at. But again, this has just started, so we're on the front edge of this. In the same way that Bullersdorf looks at Second Life, but that only has been around for now, I guess, almost 20 years. And Miller's looking at things like YouTube and social media, which again have been around for about 10 years. So one of the advantages if you're doing anthropology right now in 2020, or if you're going to be an anthropologist, is you've got these enormous new resources that never existed before. But figuring out what they mean, how they're used, what their purpose is, and how and why they're consumed is going to be something we're really going to have to think about. And will the theories that we've used in the past work for this, or do we have to come up with new theoretical backgrounds to figure out how to make sense of what this means to people? That's so that's what you might call the $20 question in 2020. So with that, that's the end of this particular segment, but hopefully you found it wildly entertaining. And if I can find that really surreal Nordic video, I will post it. It'll just be as a video in Canvas, but it's just for you to watch, not like do a reaction to.